Hello, and welcome to Ask the History Buff, the podcast that informs and educates about Canadian history. Hopefully, you will also be inspired to research some aspect of Canadian history because you heard it on Ask the History Buff. Each week, we will explore the lives of influencers, events which they influenced, and the legacy which we as Canadians have inherited because of the influencer or the events. I am Lynette, your curious Canadian history buff. I am not a degreed historian with letters behind my name, but I have researched more of our Canadian history than most people. I am always discovering new and interesting information about Canadian history, which really excites me. And that's why I call myself the Curious Canadian History Buff. I hope you will be encouraged to Google people's names and events surrounding them, just like I do, so that you can understand their impact on our society. I encourage you to follow rabbit trails when you read about past influencers in Canada. And for Christian listeners, I encourage you to be a Berean by searching out everything you hear. And if you are just too busy to search, then ask the history buff. Chances are I may have the answers to questions that you have. And if I don't, I will look for the answers and get back to you. I also encourage you to feel free to challenge my information anytime by sending your questions in to info@christianrootscanada.org. You may teach me something new. And if you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble, don't forget to hit the subscribe and like button to be informed when another podcast is here. And if you know someone who should hear this podcast, please hit the share button and forward this to them. Today, we will explore the life of John McCrae, famous poet, soldier, and doctor who gave the world the reason to wear a poppy on Remembrance Day. John McCrae's ancestry extends back into history to Scottish royalty. His parents were first generation Canadians and children of immigrants. His father was a retired lieutenant colonel. John McCrae was born on November 30th, 1872 in Guelph, Ontario. He was raised Presbyterian, remaining a devout Christian all his life, and was known to be an indefatigable churchgoer. He loved poetry, especially the poems written by Rudyard Kipling. Because he was accustomed to military life and practice, remember his dad was a lieutenant colonel, he joined a local cadet corps in his youth. Around the age of 27, he served in the Boer War that happened between 1899 and 1902, where he attained the rank of major. While serving in that war, McCrae met Kipling, describing the event in a letter to his mother. We met the high priest of it all, and I had a 5 minutes chat with him. Kipling, I mean. He visited the camp. He looks like his pictures and is very affable. He told me I spoke like a Winnipegger. He said we ought to fine the men for drinking unboiled water. Don't give them CB, it's no good. Fine them or drive common sense into them. All Canadians have common sense. That's what he said to his mother in a letter. On his return to Canada, he continued his education in medicine as a medical pathologist. His career in medicine was truly impressive. He studied under the famed doctor Sir William Osler at Johns Hopkins, and he worked as a professor at several Canadian universities. He co-authored a textbook of pathology for students of medicine. At the same time, he also ran a private practice. John was a bachelor who loved his family and friends. He made time to visit with them even though he worked long, hard hours. He was a favorite uncle to his sister's children and a socialite who had connections in high places. In 1910, around the age of 38, Governor General Sir Earl Grey requested John to join him as a physician on a journey round the country. He had a providential meeting with a young woman named Lucy Maud Montgomery, who had just published her book, Anne of Green Gables. 4 years later, in August 1914, while sailing to England for a vacation, McCrae learned that Britain, and by extension Canada, had declared war on Germany. World War I was about to explode. Although older than the average enlister, McCrae chose to serve in the war rather than to remain in Canada. He was accepted into the Canadian Army as a physician, giving his life in the process. He returned to Canada to train at Valcartier, Quebec, and after months of poorly organized training, he and the other Canadians were shipped to England. There were long delays and poor management by superiors, so that by the time he finally arrived in Europe, it was 1915, and the Second Battle of Ypres was just beginning. His rationale for joining the war is summed up in these words: "It is a terrible state of affairs, and I'm going because I think every bachelor, especially if he has experience of war, ought to go. I am really rather afraid, but more afraid to stay at home with my conscience." And that's what he said caused him to go to join the war. McCrae preferred soldiering to doctoring and served with both the artillery division and in a small makeshift hospital nearby. The Second Battle of Ypres is one of the most infamous in Canadian history. Not only was it the first action Canadians saw in that particular war, it was also the first battle that chemical warfare was introduced. Canadians and their neighbors, the French, peered out of the trenches to see billowing yellow clouds overhead. It was chlorine gas from the Germans opposite. But more devastating to McCrae than his hellish surroundings was the sudden, tragic death of a good friend and former student, 22-year-old Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. Helmer, born in Quebec but raised in Ottawa, was on assignment when he was hit by a stray shell and died instantly on May 2nd, 1915. For eager new recruits who were there for glory and believed that the war would be over by Christmas, the basic horror and inhumanity of the situation that greeted them in Ypres was a shock. McCrae described the dismal scene. Heavy gunfire again this morning, McCrae wrote later that day. Lieutenant H was killed at the guns. His diary's last words were, "It has quieted a little, and I shall try to get a good sleep." His girl's picture had a hole through it, and we buried it with him. I said the committal service over him as well as I could from memory. A soldier's death. With no chaplain available, McCrae sent one of his men for a copy of the Book of Common Prayer out of respect for Helmer's Anglican faith. He then read portions of it over his friend's grave. Although a small marker, a wooden cross, was erected, Helmer's grave was soon lost, and today it is unknown where he lies. A small group gathered together, and John McCrae recited part of the burial service, which we all are familiar with. "I am the resurrection and the life." John McCrae was terribly moved. Alex Helmer had been one of his close friends. Shortly after that, he went and sat on the ambulance, looking at the grave and then writing the original version of "In Flanders Fields," recalled Allison, a fellow officer who was with McCrae at the time. This incident impacted McCrae profoundly. In his grief, he turned to something that had always been a solace: writing poetry. The day after his friend died, he penned these words on a little notebook. "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up a quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." What McCrae did next with this poem, which he titled "In Flanders Fields," however, remains a mystery to this day. There are many variations to the story. One version is that McCrae, pleased with how it had turned out, sent it to The Spectator, a British magazine, and then returned to his work. Another story suggests that McCrae wrote the poem, then crumpled it up and threw it out, but a friend retrieved it and mailed it to The Spectator. However it happened, the poem made it to The Spectator within a few months of Helmer's death and was promptly rejected. However, a journalist discovered it and had it sent to Punch, another British magazine. The poem was accepted and published anonymously in December of 1915. And for the first time in history, "In Flanders Fields" was in print. To use today's terms, the poem literally went viral. It was, according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, being memorized, copied into letters, set to music, and translated into multiple languages. The poem was also used to raise $400 million to the war effort. "In Flanders Fields" has become the most famous poem of the Great War. McPhail, his biographer, asserts in his work, John McCrae, an essay in character, said, "It is little wonder then that in Flanders Fields has become the poem of the army. The soldiers have learned it with their hearts, which is quite a different thing from committing it to memory. It circulates as a song should circulate, by the living word of mouth, not by printed characters. That is the true test of poetry, its insistence on making itself learnt by heart." McCrae, though now one of the most famous Canadians, continued to serve as a doctor. He was also promoted to lieutenant colonel, but his friends noticed he had changed. The once youthful, energetic man was now growing old, tired, and cynical. He began using a cane. The brutality and utter depravity of the sights McCrae witnessed daily on the battlefields were taking their toll. McPhail describes these changes. "There are men who pass through such scenes unmoved. If they have eyes, they do not see, and ears, they do not hear. But John McCrae was profoundly moved, and bore in his body until the end the signs of his experience." A nursing sister in the American ambulance at Neuilly-sur-Seine met him in the wards. Although she had known him for 15 years, she did not recognize him. He appeared to her so old, so worn, his face lined and ashen gray in color, his expression dull, his actions slow and heavy. To those who have never seen John McCrae since he left Canada, this change in his appearance will seem incredible. Although he was upwards of 40 years of age when he left Canada, he had always retained an appearance of extreme youthfulness. He frequented the company of men much younger than himself, and their youth was imputed to him. His frame was tall and well knit, and he showed alertness in every move. He would arise from the chair with every muscle in action, and walk forth as if he were about to dance. In 1970, McCrae penned what scholars considered to be his greatest poem and his last. It's entitled The Anxious Dead. Months after The Anxious Dead was published, McCrae received a historic honor. He was the first Canadian to be appointed consultant physician to the British Army. Unfortunately, he was never able to accept it. A lifelong asthmatic and smoker, McCrae contracted pneumonia and then meningitis. He slipped into a coma and died 3 days later on January 28, 1918. He was 45. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, soldier, doctor, and poet, was buried in Wimereux, France. Present at his funeral was Arthur Currie, the Canadian general who oversaw Canada's attack on Vimy Ridge. 10 months later, on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the armistice was signed. The Great War was finally over. In Flanders Fields lived on after its creator's death, inspiring millions to remember those who had died in service. After the creation of Remembrance Day, the poppy was chosen as its symbol because of this poem. Today, there exist many memorials to McCrae and his most famous work. His house stands today and is a National Historic Site. There are schools, roads, and even a mountain in British Columbia named after him. McCrae and in Flanders Fields are also honored in another way as well. John A. Pearson included the poem in the Peace Tower. It is mounted on a marble plaque on the back wall of the memorial chamber, and it is written in both English and French. The poem is also memorialized in the stained glass window of the west, where the figure representing honor carries a torch inscribed with, "Be yours to hold it high." This is a quote from Flanders Fields. Remembrance Day is an important part of our Canadian heritage. In the 21st century, it's especially important to not take our freedom for granted. So we should appreciate people like John McCrae and Alexis Helmer even more for giving their lives for Canada and her future generations. Our freedom was bought by others' blood. John A. Pearson included a quotation from Pericles in the south stained glass window of the Peace Tower as a warning and encouragement to the generations to come. It says, "Freedom is the sure possession of those alone who have the courage to defend it." This Remembrance Day, be sure to stop and remember that the freedom to do what you are doing may be because someone else died in your place.